Good evening and welcome to our fourth stream about the forthcoming Israeli election. From today on, I will be doing these streams every evening up to the election date on the 1st of November and also the day after, the 2nd of November, when I will try to summarize and analyze the results of the election. Today and tomorrow, I will dedicate my stream to the question of the issues discussed in the campaign or relevant in the campaign. Today, I will talk about some domestic issues, and tomorrow I will talk about issues related to foreign policy and security. And I will start with some issues which I find interesting, and later my colleague from Hebrew University, Noam Gidron, will join me to discuss the dynamics of the right-wing politics in Israel in the context of general right-wing politics in Europe and the West in general. So let's move to some my observations about the issues arising out of this campaign. First, one general observation. Actually, to be frank, I think that this election campaign is one of the most boring that I've witnessed in the Israeli election, because there is no real and intense discussion about policy issues. These discussions do exist, but they are marginalized, and some smaller parties pay more attention to these things. But it's relatively, the campaign is relatively sleepy. This is my impression. What are the reasons for this? First, everything evolves. It's not the first campaign, but it still involves around the personality question. Basically, the basic question of the election is who is going to form the next government, whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu, former prime minister, now the leader of the opposition, or someone from the ruling coalition. And I think that most voters actually committed already. They committed to their decision. So both the focus on the personality issue and the fact that it's already fifth campaign within 2.5 years actually makes discussion a bit shallow. And the question of the election, I think, will be decided on the question who will be better in galvanizing his base. Basically, the question of the election is the question of voter turnout. Nevertheless, I will want to tell you a few things about interesting domestic issues that are relevant or are mentioned in this campaign, and also give you some background about the meaning of these issues for the election and the Israeli politics. And I will start with the question of economic policy. Generally, as I've described already in the previous streams, economy is not the issue around which we divide between the right and the left. This is not the principal topic of contention for Israeli voters. And in the history, we can see that right-wing parties or some right-wing parties may advocate some more socialist policies or state control policies, whereas some left-wing parties may actually at certain point advocate more free economy policy and implement it. But on the whole and in average, there is certain correlation between the right-wing parties and more pro-free market policy, and the left-wing parties and the more socialist policy. The general direction of the Israeli economic policies was from very socialist-oriented economy, very strong public sector, towards liberalization starting from 1980s. But still, this was not major division between the parties, perhaps until the 90s and early 2000s, and it's related to Benjamin Netanyahu, who, influenced by free marketers, especially in the American Republican Party, represented a very strong line towards the economic liberalization and actually implemented some very radical economic reform in the 90s. And when he was finance minister between 2003 and 2005, for example, the liberalization of foreign currency and the privatization of pension fund. However, when Netanyahu became prime minister again in 2009, although in the beginning he did try to implement another radical reform, which is related to, in fact, the privatization of land, because land in Israel is de facto state owned. He failed to implement this reform, and from then on, he actually abandoned all grand projects of further reform and concentrated on macroeconomic stability and investment in infrastructure. And therefore, there is not much difference between parties about the economy now, and the question is more about the allocation of budget. To what sector will the state budget go? For example, the left-wing parties will say, well, if there is a right-wing coalition, it includes very powerful religious parties, so it will subsidize too much the religious sector. And the right-wing party says, well, the current coalition, because it has an Arab party in the coalition, it subsidizes too much the Arab sector. And yet, there is one nuance in all situations, but actually it may have, under certain circumstances, an impact on the election. And it's related to this. During the last, I think, 2 decades, a young generation grew up in which there is a certain segment of young people for whom the economic issues are number one and who define themselves as free marketers. They may call themselves liberals, libertarians, or occasionally conservatives. And these young people are growingly uneasy about the fact that Netanyahu doesn't continue with economic reforms. And these young people, not all of them, but I think most of them, tend, in terms of the major divide, foreign policy and security, tend to the right. So they're mainly right-wing voters, but they're looking for someone who would advocate a very strong pro-free market line. And some of them, for example, in one of the previous elections, voted for Moshe Feiglin, who was a very hardline settler in terms of security, foreign policy, but he also advocated kind of libertarian position, not only economically, but also socially. For example, he advocated the legalization of cannabis. And today, the person who tries to appeal to this segment is Avigdor Lieberman, who is the head of the Israel Our Home Party. As I explained in the previous streams, the electoral base of Lieberman is elderly former Soviet Union immigrants. But this is probably not enough for him to pass the threshold. And therefore, at each election, he appeals to the voters with the agenda which he thinks that can bring him some more votes from people who are not necessarily Soviet Union born. For example, the previous election, he appealed to anti-religious sentiment of some voters. Now, because he's finance minister, he builds his campaign on appealing to these particular young people who are interested in free market economic policy and for whom it's number one issue. Why it may be important? First, because it helps Lieberman to pass the threshold. And second, because Lieberman is committed generally to left-wing coalition at the moment. And the only segment on the right which may go to him is this segment. So I don't know how many such people exist. Probably he made some service and discovered there are some people, but it on the margins, it may influence the result if the result is too close. So this is one issue. The other issue I would like to talk about the issue of or controversy about the power of the judiciary branch and reforms of the judiciary branch. Generally speaking, Israel has a very powerful judiciary branch. Israeli Supreme Court is very powerful. Its sphere of competence is very broad, and it took upon himself the right not, to cancel the laws legislated by Parliament, and also, in principle, the basic law, not only ordinary laws, but also the basic law legislated by the Parliament. The other part of this story is that legal advisors to the government ministries are very independent, and they may block decisions by ministers and the government if they advise that the decision is illegal. And already for 20 years, about 20 years, the political right was uneasy about very broad powers of the judiciary branch, because it believed that the judiciary branch in its decisions is biased towards left-wing policy, and therefore it's likely to not to put obstacles for implementing right-wing policy, for example, things like security or illegal immigration. However, despite this growing criticism, no reform about the judiciary branch was initiated or implemented, and there were several kinds of reforms. So, for example, the limiting the competence of the Supreme Court, changing the way the judges are appointed. For example, maybe the politicians should have more say in their appointments, and limiting the competence of legal advisors of ministers. Why not? Why no reforms? Although the right was mainly in power. First, Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't initiate any significant reform, and some people say on the right that he didn't want. Some say he couldn't. Why couldn't he? Because in the previous coalitions there were always a party which would broadly define itself as center-right, which would put veto on this on such a reform, and without support of the center, there was not enough votes. But it was not, in my view, it was not only like just particular desires of these parties, but they reflected the real positions of electorate. Generally, although the right wing grew more and more critical of the judicial branch, those voters who define themselves as center or slightly right of center, they are very suspicious of such reforms and generally tend not to approve of it. So it's a very interesting situation in my view, that although in terms of policy, for example, in foreign policy and security, the voters who define themselves as centrist tend to support the line which we can see as right-wing, at the moment, right-wing policy. But they are not prepared to adopt the policy of limiting the powers of the judiciary. They see it as an institution which may protect them, protect the citizens' rights. So actually, the political center was very skeptical about this possibility of this reform. But the situation now changed for several years, and the reason is that ongoing trial against Benjamin Netanyahu, that he was indicted in a breach of trust and bribery, and the attitude to this trial split the opinions about the judiciary system. And in fact, this is split very politically. So most people who are against Netanyahu, and generally left-wing, they do believe that these charges are serious and Netanyahu is guilty. There are some exceptions, and some people don't, but most do. The same thing is on the right. Most people who support Netanyahu also tend not to believe these charges, although, of course, there is some minority who do. And therefore, this topic of the powers of Supreme Court transforms itself to the question of whether judiciary intervenes in the democratic process. And therefore, this became a mobilization topic for both camps. The left wing now in the campaign says if there is a right-wing coalition, they will severely impair the powers of the judiciary, and will try also to cancel the trial of Netanyahu. And this argument may appeal to some voters who consider themselves as centrist. Likud is very critical of the judiciary, but it's a little bit mute about the practical things it's going to do, because I think Likud doesn't want to lose those centrist votes. But there is a party on the right to the Likud, which is called religious Zionism, and it put the reform of the judiciary at the center, at the forefront of its political platform. For example, suggesting just abolishing the crime of breach of trust. This is transgression which comes to us from the British law. It doesn't exist in many other judiciary systems. But the thing is that it's exactly the crime of which Netanyahu is accused. And therefore, it's one of the reasons that because many people who support Netanyahu, they have very strong feelings about judiciary, they tend to switch their votes from Likud to religious Zionism, which weakens Likud party in general, although it doesn't weaken the right-wing bloc. Okay, so that's a second issue. And the third issue is the question of the integration of Arab parties as legitimate partners within the Israeli political system. For many years, Arab parties in their political activity and platform didn't differentiate between the social demands, national demands, and foreign policy demands, which means they connected the improvement of the conditions of the Arab minority also with the recognition of their national demands as a national group and national rights, but also the questions of peace agreements between Israel and the Arab neighbors. And therefore, Jewish parties, both of right and left, didn't see them as acceptable partners in the coalition. And also some Arab parties also didn't think themselves that they want to be part of this coalition to give, for example, the legitimacy to the Zionist Jewish state. These things began to change a few years ago, actually before the last election campaign, in which one of the parties, headed by Mansour Abbas, this party is called RAM, and it represents mainly the Arab Bedouins from south of Israel, and it's Islamic Conservative Party in general. He said, okay, I'm going to differentiate. Okay, whatever our views on the Arab-Israeli conflict, I do recognize the idea that the fact there is a Jewish state. I'm going now to deal with social questions, social improvements for my voters, and therefore I consider it as possible to cooperate with a Jewish party. And during the last campaign, the then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu signed that he is going actually to integrate at least some of the Arab voters, and he appealed to the Arab voters during his campaign, but also maybe he has some kind of talk and negotiations with this party Ram of Mansour Abbas of joining his coalition, right-wing coalition. And there certainly was talk between Likud and Mansour Abbas. There are some disagreements about how far the Likud was prepared to go in order to get the support of this party. However, the party to the right of Netanyahu, religious Zionism, vetoed this idea at all. That's absolutely unacceptable, and this idea was not implemented. And in fact, Abbas joined the left-wing coalition, the current coalition. And after he joined it, the right-wing parties, including Likud, began their main point of criticism was that this coalition is dependent on the votes of RAM members of Knesset, and it accused this party of being part of the Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore quite inimical to the interests of Israel. And that was a talking point which was very prominent among opinion makers in social networks affiliated with the right wing. Now, during this election, there is a mirror condition for the left wing. Why? Because of what happens on the far right part of the Israeli political map. as I explained in previous streams, right actually is better prepared for the election in terms that it doesn't have parties which are in danger of not crossing the threshold, of losing right-wing votes. But one reason why this is so is because the two far-right parties unite. One of them is the party of Bezalel Smotrich, who is the leader of hardline religious settler community. But the other part is represented by Itamar Ben-Gvir and his followers, and his past is affiliated with the groups affiliated with far-right Rabbi Meir Kahana. And because not only left-wing but also centrists consider this group as absolutely unacceptable, they say, okay, if Netanyahu, if right-wing forms a coalition, these people like Itamar Ben-Gvir will be part of his coalition. So, and all this kind of talk, on the one hand, right speaks about the danger of Islamist kind of being the influencing left-wing coalition, and left-wing talking about fascist influencing the right-wing coalition. It basically, first, of course, it may scare the centrist voters, and the question of what they think is more dangerous or worse for them. Okay, so that's kind of, there is a discussion on social networks a lot. What is worse and why? But I myself don't believe there is many such voters that remain. So basically, what it serves is to mobilize the base. Okay, if you go to right-wing voter who is not that adamant at going to election, but say, okay, if you don't vote, there will be Islamists in the government, it's very dangerous. Then he maybe you can convince him that he comes to the ballot box. And the opposite also is also true, maybe. That if if you don't come to election, maybe Itamar Ben-Gvir will be the minister in the government. And it's really, really, really bad. Okay, so the basic, and I think the principal question of this election is a question of voter turnout. That's what decide this election, and just a few words about this. Generally, high left-wing electorate, or more precisely, left-wing Jewish electorate votes in higher numbers than the right-wing Jewish electorate, because left-wing Jewish electorate belongs generally to, in average, to higher social economic status. That's a general universal thing that people with high social economic status tend to vote more than those with low economic status, and therefore here there is an advantage for the left because its voters come in greater numbers. And one of the reasons why Likud didn't win the previous election was a relatively low turnout in its strongholds. But there is one specific disadvantage in the left-wing camp. It's Arab voters. Arab voters are lowest in terms of their turnout. Now, in this election, the high voter turnout will likely benefit the right wing. Why? First, because of course there are more right-wing voters who haven't voted last times, but also because it so happened, as we explained in the last stream, that all significant parties which are in risk of not crossing the threshold are all left-wing parties, 2 Arab parties and 2 Jewish left-wing parties. And if only one of them doesn't pass the threshold, the election is nailed in favor of the right wing. So it's very this question is very critical, and the higher turnout is, then the higher the amount of voters needed to pass the threshold. However, I just checked the weather forecast, and this Tuesday's election day is going to be the rainiest day in this week. So it may actually impact voter turnout, because every rain in our country and every snow in our country is a kind of local catastrophe. And the rain may, in my opinion, the rain may benefit the right, the left, the left wing in this election. So it's my opening monologue, and now I'm happy to have with us a colleague of mine from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Noam Gidron. Thank you, Noam, for joining me.
High five. Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
Thank you. And we are going to talk now about the right-wing politics and your research into right-wing politics and its implication for the Israeli politics. But just before we do this, maybe you've heard what I said. Maybe you have some objections, disagreements with what I said. Maybe you want to correct me, so feel free.
Well, first of all, I very much enjoyed your introductory comments. I would say that the second half of your comments convinced me that maybe you were wrong in your first half of the comments. So you started, I actually took notes of your introduction. You said at the beginning that this was one of the most boring campaigns, and with that, I completely agree. So when you asked me to speak with you here a little bit about the campaign, I was actually very cautious about that because I was just afraid I won't have much to say because I didn't even feel the campaign around me. I don't think people were emotionally invested in it in many ways, maybe just because we are so tired of it now that we are approaching the fifth elections. But still, so with that, I agree. But I'm not sure I'm convinced by the claim that this is mostly about personalities and personally who will be the prime minister. Because I think you very nicely outlined later on that to some degree what this election is about is the limits of legitimacy in Israeli policy and who's considered a legitimate actor. And we have this on the left side with the Arab parties, and we have this on the right side with the far-right party, or at least parties that contain far-right elements. And I think that this is a battle that will have consequences also for future elections and potential coalitions. So to a large degree, I do think that there's a lot on the line here, more than just a question of personality, and I'm sure we'll talk about it some more.
I completely accept this criticism, and then this is the opportunity for me to correct actually what I wanted to say, in a sense that I think that the issues in the campaign are tremendously important.
Okay.
But I think that there is no such we don't feel any So all people already, most of the, I think, voters are convinced that this is important. They already made their decision, so they don't really care about what's going in the campaign. So campaign by itself is boring, but the result may turn out to be not so boring.
Yes. So, okay. So I wanted us to disagree, but it seems like we are more or less on the same page.
Yeah. But we'll have more things to talk about, so maybe we will disagree then. And I will just for the benefit of our viewers, I want to just to put as an example one of a very interesting article that you published. So you made your name as one of the leading experts in the contemporary right-wing politics in the West. Yeah, so it's one of your articles here. And what I would like to first ask you, and feel free to take it in the order in which you would like to discuss it first, to explain what's your basic understanding of the current right-wing politics, which is usually called populism. I don't like this word. We can argue later about this. I think this word misses something. And also, do we fit in the general picture? Is the Israeli right-wing politics similar to what we have in other countries, Europe, United States, or it's something different? So let's please have a word.
Okay, so maybe first of all, thanks a lot for your kind words, as always. And maybe I can mention 3 issues that I think we can observe when we analyze trends in electoral support for the right across Western democracies. And then we can discuss to what degree they resonate with what we see here in Israel, And of course, I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay.
And I think that first, it's important just to think about these terms, left and right. So we often think about them as symmetrical political blocks or different sides of the same coin, right? Public opinion may shift to the left or may shift to the right. But one of the things that I found out when analyzing survey data collected across Western democracies from the 90s till today is that there's actually a very sharp asymmetry across the left-right divide. And it goes like this. Leftists tend to be progressive on a host of different issues: the economy, immigration, LGBT rights, etc. In contrast, it's enough to be conservative on just one of those issues in order to identify as right-wing. So here, I'm not talking about ideology in the sense of political thinkers, political philosophers of the type that you usually analyze. I'm looking at something different, how people define themselves. Whether when we ask someone if he or she identifies as left or right, what do they say? And what I find is that here we have this asymmetry, that leftists are pretty coherent, even though people on the left like to emphasize their disagreements, they actually don't disagree that much. And when there are disagreements, it's disagreements in degree, but they are all progressive on all sorts of issues. In contrast, on the right, you find different types of right-wing constituencies or right-wing groups of voters who are conservative on some issues, but not necessarily other. And that we see across Western democracies. I think that we also see that in Israel, including this asymmetry between left and right in public opinion, but we can talk about it more later on. So that's one point I wanted. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe just to exemplify it for the viewers. Just for example, if a certain voter is a socialist in terms of the economic policy, but he's adamantly against LGBT right, most chances that this voter will vote for the right, for a certain right-wing party.
Exactly. Yes. And those on the left are most likely to be progressive on a long list of different issues, from the environment to LGBT to state intervention in the economy. So on the right, you have a much more heterogeneous groups of voters. And there are pros and cons for that, right? It's a more diverse coalition, so you have more diverse groups of voters that you can try and mobilize. At the same time, it could be pretty challenging to balance these diverse coalitions, right? With groups of voters with very different worldviews. So that's one issue. That's one point I wanted to make about the current state of right-wing politics, that we have this asymmetry. The second is that by we, I mean academics and maybe also pundits, we've been so preoccupied with the perennial crisis of social democracy that we haven't paid much attention to the fact that center-right parties are also struggling across Western democracies. They are searching their ways. They are thinking about who are their potential coalition partners, what is the core identity to which voters they should try to appeal. And even though the support is somewhat more stable than the support for center-left parties, we actually see that center-right parties are at the moment struggling across many Western democracies, Anglo-American democracies and Western Europe. So I'm saying that because we often like to talk about the decline, the death, the crisis of the center-left, but actually center-right parties are also searching for their ways, and we see that across many countries.
But now now I think the best example now is just what happens to the Conservative Party in Britain, because it's such a diverse coalition, which actually all what we see about the changes in Prime Minister is just a symptom that it's a coalition of very, very broad and diversified opinions who push to very different directions.
And just to keep that in perspective, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but in the UK, that's the only conservative or center-right government that we currently have in the Anglo-American democracies, right? Which were traditionally center-right countries. So it just, I think, reflects the deep crisis, ideological, electoral crisis of these center-right parties. And here, to some degree, maybe Israel is an exception, maybe because the power of Benjamin Netanyahu And it raises an interesting question: what will happen to the center right here after the Netanyahu era? But we can discuss this later.
But the question is, could you point exactly what the exception is? In what sense it may be an exception?
Simply the fact that we haven't seen a very sharp decline in electoral support for the center-right in Israel compared to many other Western democracies.
And here I would,
yeah. So maybe I'll just make my third point, and then we can discuss them all together, or none.
Yeah, sure.
And the third point is the question that you also alluded to in your comment, and that the boundaries or lack thereof between what's considered mainstream or center-right and what's considered radical, populist, far-right. And we can discuss the different labels, but I think it's clear what we are talking about. And here we see, let's put Israel in the side for a moment. We see this playing out in many multi-party democracies where center-right parties have to decide whether they construct a coalition with far-right parties or not, or whether they try to have coalitional agreements with centrist or even center-left parties. And Sweden is just the most recent example where a center-right party that for a long time simply didn't consider or didn't agree to have any coalition agreements with the far right. The center-right has changed its mind and is now in coalition or some kind of quasi-coalition with the far right. That's not always the case, right? At least in Germany, we haven't seen, at least at the federal level, this type of cooperation between the mainstream right. In Germany, that would be the Christian Democrats and the radical right. And here in Israel, for a long time, there was also, I think, a clear distinction compared to what we see at the moment within the right-wing bloc. So that, in a way, just to conclude by going back to the beginning, I think to some degree we are also seeing here in this election campaign the question of who's a legitimate political actor, not just in terms of running to parliament, but also legitimate in terms of should be part of mainstream politics, consider the potential coalition partner. We see this on the center left with the Arab parties, but more clearly, I think we see this on the center right with the question of the radical right parties in a way that really, I think, is similar to what is playing out in many Western democracies. Okay, so these were my 3 points, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, so I'll let you.
Yeah, I will just take it from here, and I will just add in this respect that actually the strategies of justification of making coalition with these extremes are also very very similar. For example, when the left center wants to make coalition with an Arab party, it says, and actually many on the right used to say too, but they forgot it during this campaign, that this party is genuinely has genuinely transformed itself, and it really doesn't reject the Jewish state. Whereas the current right wing during the campaign say, no, they're lying. It's deception. In fact, they're Islamists. They're committed to the destruction of the Jewish state. They just trick us. But the same thing goes with regard to the far right in the right wing coalition, because there are many people on this, and I found it's very, very very interesting that many intellectuals on the center right, and even those who were kind of center, they suddenly begin to say, well, Itamar Ben-Gvir is quite not extreme, he's moderate. And he himself says, I changed my opinions. Okay, so it's even less the politicians who say that, it's more the intellectuals of right, of different sorts. And of course, many people on left say, no, it's all wrong. Itamar Ben-Gvir is exactly as he was 20 years ago. And I think there are also similar debates in other countries. For example, in Italy. So this new prime minister of Italy, her roots in the neo-fascist party, but they say, okay, it's different now. It's not really neo-fascist. It's something else.
Yeah. So I'm hesitant about drawing the normative symmetry between the two sides, but that aside, I think that Okay, I'll say something slightly different, just to further emphasize the similarities between what we are seeing in Israel and what we are seeing abroad. I think this dilemma of center-right parties of whether to cooperate or keep distance from the far right, these are similar dilemmas. And what we've seen across the developed democracies is that as mainstream right parties or governing right parties intensify their cooperation with the far right, it only feeds support for the far right. And I think that's in a way exactly what we are seeing here electorally, right? As mainstream.
Actually, I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things that puzzled me during this election.
No, I was sure we were going to disagree on many things.
Yeah, but thing which puzzles me during this election, and I don't understand it, what the kind of tactical logic of it is that during the campaign, Likud, which is a moderate right-wing party, abstained from criticizing or didn't distance itself enough from the far right party, because it kind of doesn't make sense in terms of political tactics, because, well, Likud should appeal to the centrist voters and leave the far right voters to this party. But it didn't distance itself significantly, but on the contrary, and again, many intellectuals or opinion makers affiliated with Likud, actually they say, well, actually Ben Gvir is quite a legitimate partner. That's interesting. But there is no. The reason there is no symmetry in this sense with the left wing is simply their extreme, which is Ram, it cannot grow at the expense of Jewish voters. So there is no such problem for the left wing. But at the moment, according to polls, maybe it's kind of will turn out different. But according to the polls, the religious Zionism electorally grows at the expense of the Likud.
So I'll just note that because we have different perspectives, right, and as scholars we are interested in different issues, you are emphasizing the roles of intellectuals, right, on the center-right and the centrist political arena. And I would just say that the parties themselves are cooperating, right, in the sense of working together or of coordinating the campaign. So it's not just an issue of intellectuals writing some pamphlets about who's legitimate or not. It's like actual party strategies. I'm curious if you have an intuition about why this is going on, even if you think it makes no sense, just because you may be more closely familiar than me with some of those decision makers.
Actually, those decision makers I talked about actually recommended a completely different strategy.
Okay.
So I don't, not the decision makers, but those who counsel them. So I don't know why, and I think there is much more chaos in this than it looks like. We think that in campaign everything is planned. No, I think there are many kind of second level operatives who just don't think about this. Things strategically. But I would actually want to bring intellectuals back. Okay. And also in relation to what you said before, in the sense that maybe our case at the moment is exception because we have very strong center-right wing leader, Netanyahu, who doesn't actually let many other fringe elements from different directions on the right to grow. And what I see during the last years, that the situation is becoming more complicated because of there emerged a kind of subgroup of intellectuals, opinion makers, who write on social networks and newspapers that appear on TV, who are present themselves as new intellectuals of the right.
You're talking about the free marketers you mentioned?
No. It's usually the people called bibists, but I don't think they're bibists. Okay, I think it's something different. I think they're becoming Trumpists in a sense. Trumpists,
okay. Yes,
yeah, not bibists. Yeah, okay. So I think, and they try to formulate kind of alternative ideology for the right wing beyond Netanyahu. Although it looks like give full support to Netanyahu, but Netanyahu is a more traditional politician of the right. And they think, I think, they're very influenced by the right-wing intellectual scene in the United States, especially those who are pro-Trump. And they take and bring these ideas and try to propagate them here. In Israel, for example, kind of populist class struggle argument. That's kind of common people against the elite. It's the idea of kind of conspiracy of the establishment and deep state and things like this. Now, and I think, and these people, intellectuals, are usually, their roots are not in Likud or center right. Their roots are sometimes on the moderate left, on the left. So there are many people who come to this kind of right, as you explained. And what I think what happens is that this Trumpist influence also impacts on their attitude to the far right, because Trump co-opted the energies of some people on the fringes for his campaign, even if he disagreed with many of the issues. And I think that's what happens to the not the party scene of Likud, but intellectual scene of the Likud. So, and that's how it explains it. Usually, party operatives thinks in terms of tactics, and intellectuals put kind of normative limits to what is expected. And usually, what would happen in previous situations, that party operatives say, okay, let's cooperate with Ben Gvir on the level of on the field, but the right-wing intellectuals will say, no, there is a limit to this. But I think what happens now is the opposite. Actually, those who drive the legitimation process of Ben Gvir are actually not party operatives, but the intellectuals of the right. And party operatives, then it's okay, then it's fine. That would be my tentative explanation to the situation.
Yeah. So first, I would say that I think that if we have the same figures in mind, these are more like media commentators, I'd say, rather than full-fledged intellectuals. But
it doesn't matter. Like it's just like because
that's besides the point.
In the stream, I try to become very practical and cynical in terms that it's my terms for right wing, left wing, for intellectual, not intellectual. They're not normative, they're not kind of, but that's specifically operational terms to distinguish between things. Intellectuals, there are those who are who work in journalistics and academia, and they deal with ideas.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the definition.
I guess I would try maybe push you a little bit, to push back a little bit, and ask you, well, where are the so-called traditional center-right conservative intellectuals, right? Like, so you are saying there's a new group of public figures pushing for the normalization of the far right and for the mainstreaming of nativist authoritarian ideas that you say traditionally were not necessarily part of the ideological agenda of the Israeli center-right. And I would say, okay, maybe there's a new group, but if you think they are taking over the party, where are those old guard intellectuals that's supposed to push back, right?
Well, I think that two kinds. The first, that sometimes happens like the people who move to the left. Once you affiliate with left, you adopt also what is in Israel regarded as left-wing outlook. We can see it, for example, in America, when some former neoconservatives moved very strongly, like Bill Kristol, for example. Okay, yes. So that's one situation. The other situation is, I think, is because the intensity of personality question. For example, like I think many standard right-wing intellectuals, they look at now the political divide as many ordinary voters as divide on the question between for or against Netanyahu, and I think that injustice was done to Netanyahu and to the voters of Netanyahu, and therefore I think many people just don't pay attention to what is growing on the margins of the right. So it's kind of it's not regarded as the issue, but I think that that's what happens. And I think that actually many people who adopt Trump formulas, they also don't really realize what these Trump formulas mean. Okay, for example, I don't want to go now into foreign policy issues because this will be the next day, but I will give just one example. There is there is kind of tasted civil war within the intellectual right about the attitude towards the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Okay.
And there's a significant amount of right-wing opinion makers who are very anti-Ukrainian or like implicitly anti-Ukrainian in what they say. And their position springs partly from certain intellectuals within the American right, for whom the main enemy is Biden. And everything that Biden does is wrong. And they they say he caused this war. And this is the view adopted by these right-wing commentators in Israel. And so actually, and I don't know if you agree, sometimes previously the left-wing political opinion in Israel looked like a branch of the Democrat Party of the United States. For example, if you read the Aris newspaper and its headlines, sometimes it looks like it's just an American newspaper for whom what's most important is what happens in Washington, because they're so emotionally affiliated with the Democrat Party in the United States. And I think this is now what characterizes a part of the right-wing commentators and opinion makers in Israel, is that they deeply care about the American debate, but on the Trump side. So that would be, and here actually, and that's what emphasizes my point. What I want to say is that whereas the party politics, and even Netanyahu himself, they don't reflect what happens in the political right in the West, the intellectual do, and they import these ideas and this outlook, which somehow very different from what Likud outlook would be before.
Yes. So I saying that the civil war, it suggests within the intellectual right, it suggests that you have two sides that are more or less equal in power, and it seems to me
not
like
necessarily.
Okay, not necessarily. I accept. So I'd say it's not an equal civil war, because it seems to me like most of the energy is on definitely one side, and I can think of only one speaker with whom I'm speaking at the moment who is pushing on the other side. So
there are more of them, but they're less salient in the principles media vehicles. That's kind of, there is a very there are people like this. And it just their voice is less heard. And the reason for this is because I think the whole campaign is based on the question of the rejection of the establishment because of this trial of Netanyahu, and that those people who are capable of mobilizing this intellectual energy are people who adopt this anti-deep state discourse. But this anti-deep state discourse also comes with many other things which cause these people say, well, because I personally heard from some intellectuals whom, well, you wouldn't even consider right, you consider quite far to the left in terms of their opinions. And I said, okay, I listened to it, Ben-Gvir, I met with Ben-Gvir, and he looks like quite a sensible and moderate person. And I think it's because whole energies are directed to this. And this is, I think, one of the many negative consequences from this trial. And it's one of the negative consequences of this trial for the political situation in Israel. I'm trying to be just because you push me to my opinion, but I say, well, views, you don't need to accept mine. I may be completely wrong, and in some things, Noam said that I'm wrong, but you also add other things in which I'm wrong, right? Don't just only when I talk about facts, believe me. When I speak about opinions, don't believe me at all. Yes,
you don't have to believe me even when I'm talking about facts. That's fine. So I'll just mention, maybe on this note, it's interesting to reflect a little bit about where the Israeli right will stand after the elections, and or in the next few years. And here, if you accept my thesis that leftists are more or less the same, but there are many ways to be right, and within the right, you have many different constituencies with different, in some cases, even contradictory worldviews on different issues, it's interesting to think how they can be held together. And I think that for a long time, Netanyahu, because of his qualities, his intellectual qualities, his charisma, and maybe we can think about other qualities, was able to offer something to different constituencies on the right. He was able to hold together this diverse coalition through the power of his leadership. He had something to offer to those who want free market, which you mentioned at the beginning, and I'll say a word about it later on. He had something to offer for them through the neoliberal reform that he led as a finance minister. He had something to offer for those who wanted more emphasis on the national character of the state compared to some other conceptions of what Israel is about. For all these different groups, he had something to offer. And I think it's challenging to think who else would be able to hold such a strong coalition together. And maybe you have some thoughts about it. And I think that the way in which you presented it at the beginning suggested as if the energy is now on the side of those who demand free market. And the libertarian faction within the Israeli right, which you mentioned, I think very, very, very rightly so, is very vocal on Twitter. And I would say that it's vocal on Twitter and in Mount Scopus, where we both teach. I'm not sure it's very present in the electorate as a whole, right? Which doesn't mean that it's not important. I'm not sure that's where the energy of the right-wing electorate is at the moment. And I do think that we see this enthusiasm and growing support, which is in some ways endogenous to the strategies of the center-right, actually on the more nativist, which is not free marketer at all, the more nativist side of the right-wing coalition. So maybe we're going to see also shift within the balance of the Israeli right with the question of whether there's another leader that can hold everything together through the sheer power of his intellectual and charismatic qualities.
You raise several very important points, and I comment on some of them. The first is to clarify my position. I don't think the libertarians have a really strong impact, even within the right. Just specifically in this election, they may have the small impact, which actually will turn tables up. And this is one thing. The other thing, I think you ask about what will happen after Netanyahu. But before that, I will make one comment on what I think about Netanyahu, because I disagree. I disagree with how many people, especially on the left, see Netanyahu. So they usually put Netanyahu as one of the populist leaders in the world who symbolize this trend. They put him together with Trump and with Viktor Orban, what they call populist. I think we can talk later if we like this concept. But we all understand what this means. My opinion is different. I think that Netanyahu represents a more kind of old school right wing, and he was much more at ease in the would be much more at ease with people like Thatcher and others. And I don't think he was at ease with Trump. He used him very, very very elegantly, let's say, like he turned him towards what he was interested in. So my position is that actually its existence, presence of Netanyahu prevents the right wing from going full Trump. At the moment, we don't know how, in terms of parties, it will play out. But at the moment, Netanyahu steps down. It's possible that the rhetoric and the policies of the Israeli right will be similar to those of Trump. And what may happen actually is it's not, maybe it will not happen in exactly the same way, but what may happen is what happened in Turkey with the right wing. So if we look at Turkey of the 90s, what we see there is a dominance of two liberal right-wing parties, which are generally pro-free market, and they are moderately traditional and religious. Okay, and they enjoy the support of lower middle class electorate of Anatolia, that's the Asian inner part of Turkey. Once these parties get completely destroyed by the financial crisis, the party that takes this electorate, actually presenting itself as a synthesis of liberal and religious agenda, is AKP of Erdogan. Because when we talk about early 2000s, actually they don't appeal only to fundamentalists, they also appeal to lower middle class who want free market and also entering the European Union. That's kind of synthesis. And with the time, the religious element becomes more salient in their policies. So we have candidates in Israel. We have candidates for Erdogan. For example, Shas. It may appeal to a broader right-wing electorate. What limits it is just like ethnic party. It's mainly party of Middle Eastern religious or traditional Jews. But I'm talking in principle. We don't know if it's Shas or just broader coalition. It just will catch up most of this lower middle class electorate of Likud, and will offer a different deal. A different deal in which, for example, the role of religion and tradition, which will be stronger than the role, for example, of revisionism, middle class, free market, and so on. That's one of the possibilities of this. And actually, yeah.
No, I would just say that, as a comparativist, we usually think, okay, in terms of regions of Western Europe, Anglo-American democracies, and I think it makes a lot of sense to think more about other cases that are maybe less studied in the comparative politics literature, and thinking about the Israeli-Turkish comparison seems very smart. I'm not sure I fully agree with your definition of Netanyahu, but maybe we can agree on the fact that, like the great masters, he has different periods, right, in which he adopts different political styles and leads his party in different ways. And more broadly, there's an interesting story here to be told, and probably we will not solve this issue right now, right? About the evolution of the Likud party from something that is maybe somewhat similar to a Christian Democratic Party, to a conservative, to a neoconservative party, and now maybe moving closer to the populist regions of the right-wing bloc. I think that's a fascinating journey. And one that we are still observing to see where it leads.
I think one of the things that may prevent Likud from becoming such a party is that, despite all the talk about those intellectuals who speaks about second Israel and the first Israel, Likud is still catch-all party, and it actually enjoys such big support because it appeals to different segments.
Yes, with that I agree.
Yeah, but because other segments are kind of quiet voters for Likud, you have a lot of middle class European descent people who vote for Likud, but they do it quietly. Also, like strong support, for example, from Russian-speaking community for Likud. Like in Likud, in Russian-speaking communities, there is basically only three players. It's Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid, Likud, and Lieberman. They're split more or less evenly. Okay, so for example, and these voters, each of these segments brings several mandates. So what is called social periphery, so those who are not part of the elite, the second Israel, they're a kind of diverse group. And if, for example, Likud tries to emphasize only one part of it, for example, to appeal to the Middle East descent voters, or traditional voters, if it does too much, it immediately loses many other voters. That's what I think prevents Likud from going full way, for example, populist.
I agree with a lot of what you said, and especially the characterization of Likud right now as a catch-all party. I think the question is whether they will manage to keep these diverse constituencies. We do see countries across Western democracies that used to be catch-all parties, and they simply didn't manage to build bridges between the different constituencies, right? We see this also on the center left, right? Center left Labour parties also used to be catch-all cross-class coalitions, and they are increasingly struggling in appeasing all the different sides of the coalition in a way that forces them to, maybe not forces them, nudges them towards focusing on one constituency on the expense of another one. Whether the Likud would manage to keep this very delicate balance after Netanyahu, that remains to be seen.
I would say that this split within left wing didn't prevent it from forming a coalition. So the fact that, for example, if Likud after now splits in several camps, this by itself doesn't mean that they won't be able to form some coalition between this. But there are certainly some kind of undercurrents in Likud now, and it's not in leadership. But I emphasize the intellectuals who are not intellectuals in the sense that they're great philosophers, but in intellectuals term, that they're opinion makers who try to change the identity of the party. For example, to change it to more kind of traditional, more party toward religion. It's not on the level of the leadership, but when we look at middle level of like messages and in Twitter and other place, it's also appeal to religious what how Likud strongly defends the traditional character of the state and the Jewish religion, and it's not something which was strongly emphasized before. But again, maybe we also can imagine that the events will intervene. For example, if again there will be some security crisis, all this will be irrelevant, and Likud will again be like a standard right-wing security party.
Yes, I agree, although, of course, events tend to intervene even when intellectuals wouldn't want them to. But I think that adopting a long-term perspective, as you say, there are different groups, also upper middle class and middle class voters for the Likud, and they maybe have a different vision of Israeli society. And if they feel unwelcome, then that's a major problem for the Likud. And
on the other hand, when I think about the image that Likud had in the early 80s, there was much uneasiness. And actually, when Netanyahu came, he turned it towards more actually liberal middle class elements. So it's just kind of, it's not only one way direction. So these things sometimes change depending on the events.
I agree, and I think I mentioned before that I think Netanyahu was especially well positioned to manage this coalition, right? So oftentimes people in Israel ask, why do we see the left struggling and Netanyahu in power for so long? And the answer that people give are usually about the weakness of the left and less so about Netanyahu's unique position in Israeli politics. And I think that his unique position is, at least to some degree, an outcome of the fact that he had something to offer to all the different factions. And we are maybe more familiar than some of the viewers of this streaming. So I don't want to just mention names that maybe won't say much to the viewers, but other politicians within Likud or the right-wing bloc, I think, had something to give to one part of the coalition. And they were very much identified with a certain constituency on the right.
But really, let's give names, because our viewers are those who are supposed to be very interested in details. And okay. So let's give an example. Let's give examples. For example, if you talk about.
So I think that you would very much appreciate a politician like Steinitz, right? Who was
Yuval Steinitz. Yeah,
right.
He's an intellectual, and he's interested in the high politics, like security issues, energy, things like this.
Yeah, and I think that he appealed to the more liberal constituency, maybe at certain points to those who prefer free market vision of the economy or something along these lines. I'm not sure that he had much to offer those who prefer a more nativist position on issues regarding the position of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, for instance. I'm not sure he had much to offer to them. So I think that he's an example for a certain person that definitely played an important role within the right-wing coalition and the Likud party, but he didn't have the ability to speak across these different audiences like Netanyahu has.
Yes, and for example, we have there people who represent settler national religious community. But for example, one of them, like a relative strong kind of representative of this, Zev Elkin, just switched to Gidon Saar, for example. That's an example. They have Miri Regev, who appeals completely different electoral base, people who basically not ideologically committed to right-wing security, foreign policy affairs, but are very interested both in social populism, but sometimes it comes also with ethnic populism. It's not always like this, although sometimes she also managed to get support from some liberal parts of Likud, but generally her image is kind of social populist.
But she would have, so she's a very popular politician, and I think she's very popular within the Likud. I don't think she has much to offer to those people you mentioned at the beginning who prioritize economic issues, economic liberalization, right? Actually, maybe.
But I will surprise you. Most groups in Likud who are affiliated with liberalism always recommended her. Even LGBT community, for example, recommended her, and liberals in Likud recommended her because she made some kind of cancelled a law about books which limited free trade of the books, things like that. So somehow she managed to secure the support during the primaries.
Yeah, although I would just say that the word liberal has so many different meanings that I'm not sure that it's always used in a.
But you should distinguish, for example, between people like Miri Regev and people who are populist more strongly on the right. For example, for whom like the questions of immigrants and refugees the most important. Like people like Mai Golan, the people whose agenda is to, for example, to object to the presence of the African immigrants in Tel Aviv. So Miri Regev, for example, sometimes touches on this topic, but she's not committed to it. There are people more on the right in this respect who are committed.
And I think that both of them do not have much to offer. Maybe you will disagree. They don't have much to offer to the rising middle class. No. In Israel, those who are highly educated, who work in the high-tech sector. And that's a constituency that I think, at least at certain points, Netanyahu was able to address and to speak with them on their terms.
Yeah, there are some people in the Likud who do speak to this kind of people. For example, Yariv Levin, who is very right-wing on policy issues, but he appeals more to middle-class voters of Likud. Or, for example, Yuli Edelstein, or Nir Barkat, for example, high-tech millionaire who became a mayor of Jerusalem, and he does appeal more to middle-class and center-right members of Likud. Yeah. Okay, I think we covered most of the topics. Is there anything that is left?
I think we covered too many topics.
Yeah, but it was really, really such a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining me. It was a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure, Chaim. Thank you so much for doing this public good service.
Thank you, Noam. And we'll continue to follow what's going on. And now our stream is about to end. We'll meet tomorrow and we'll talk a little bit about the foreign affairs and security policy issues that are relevant to this campaign. Thank you for watching and have a nice time.